The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Rajmahal Palace as Captain Vikram Singh adjusted his ceremonial sword for what he believed would be the last time. 25 years of loyal service had weathered his face like ancient stone, but his eyes still burned with the intensity that had earned him the position of head of royal security. Today, however, that same intensity was fueled not by duty, but by betrayal. Vikram had discovered something that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy he had sworn to protect. Hidden deep within the palace archives, behind false walls and forgotten passages, lay evidence of the greatest treasure heist in the kingdom's history. The irony was not lost on him that the thieves were not common criminals breaking into the palace, but members of the royal family themselves, systematically looting their own heritage. The discovery had been accidental. 3 weeks earlier, during a routine security inspection of the palace's lower levels, Vikram had noticed inconsistencies in the architectural plans. Rooms that should have existed according to the original blueprints were missing, replaced by solid walls that seemed newer than the surrounding structure. His military training had taught him to question such anomalies, and his curiosity had led him down a path that would forever change his relationship with the crown. Behind those false walls, Vikram had found empty chambers that once housed priceless artifacts. Dust patterns on the floors revealed the recent removal of heavy objects, while torn silk coverings suggested hasty departures. Most damning of all were the detailed inventories he discovered, written in the distinctive handwriting of Prince Arjun, the king's younger brother. These documents cataloged hundreds of precious items that had been secretly removed from the palace over the past 5 years. The treasure list read like a museum catalog of India's greatest cultural heritage. Ancient sculptures from the Gupta period, worth millions in today's market, had been carefully documented before their removal. Jewelry belonging to queens from centuries past, including the legendary peacock crown embedded with emeralds from the Golconda mines, had been photographed and assessed for sale. Even sacred texts written on palm leaves, irreplaceable manuscripts that belonged to the nation's spiritual heritage, had been itemized and priced. Vikram's investigation had revealed a sophisticated operation involving not just Prince Arjun, but also several high-ranking palace officials and international art dealers. The scheme had been operating under the cover of restoration projects and security relocations, with official paperwork that appeared legitimate to casual observers. Trucks would arrive at night, ostensibly to transport artifacts to specialized conservation facilities, but the items would instead disappear into private collections around the world. The captain's loyalty to the crown ran deeper than personal ambition or financial gain. His grandfather had served the royal family during the independence struggle, and his father had given his life protecting the king during the political upheaval of the 1970s. For Vikram, guarding the royal treasures was not merely a job, but a sacred duty passed down through generations of his family. The discovery that those he protected were themselves the greatest threat to the kingdom's heritage felt like a dagger through his heart. As he walked through the palace halls that morning, Vikram noticed things he had previously overlooked. The absence of certain paintings that had hung in the corridors for decades, explained away as being cleaned or reframed. Empty pedestals in the sculpture gallery, their missing occupants supposedly on loan to museums that Vikram now knew did not exist. Even the queen's personal jewelry collection showed gaps, with duplicate pieces of lesser quality replacing originals that had been in the family for generations. The weight of his discovery pressed heavily on Vikram's shoulders as he prepared for his meeting with King Maharaj Pratap Singh. He had requested this audience under the pretense of discussing security upgrades, but he knew it would be the most important conversation of his career. In his uniform pocket, he carried copies of the incriminating documents, photographs of the empty chambers, and a detailed report that could bring down the monarchy or restore its honor, depending on the king's response. The palace seemed unusually quiet that morning, as if sensing the approaching storm. Servants moved through their duties with subdued efficiency, and even the usually chattering peacocks in the royal gardens appeared solemn. Vikram wondered if others suspected what he had discovered, or if the guilt of the conspirators had cast an invisible pall over the entire residence. Standing before the ornate doors of the king's private study, Vikram took a deep breath and considered the magnitude of what he was about to do. He could simply resign and walk away, taking his knowledge to the grave and preserving the monarchy's reputation. He could report his findings to the authorities and let justice take its course, regardless of the consequences for the royal family. Or he could confront the king directly and demand action, risking everything on the hope that the monarch's honor remained intact. The choice seemed obvious to a man who had dedicated his life to truth and duty, but Vikram understood that his decision would affect not just the royal family, but the thousands of people who depended on the palace for their livelihoods, the tourists who came to marvel at India's royal heritage, and the nation's pride in its cultural legacy. As the doors opened and he was announced to the king, Vikram steeled himself for a confrontation that would determine whether justice or loyalty would prevail. The king looked up from his morning correspondence, his aged face showing the wear of decades of leadership. Vikram had always admired the monarch's dignity and wisdom, making his next actions all the more painful. As he approached the royal desk, the evidence burning like fire in his pocket, Vikram knew that the next few moments would define not only his own legacy, but the future of the crown itself. Outside the study windows, the palace gardens bloomed with jasmine and roses, their beauty unchanged by the corruption that had taken root in the shadows. Soon, Vikram would learn whether that beauty was worth preserving through silence, or whether truth demanded the courage to speak regardless of consequences. The morning sun continued its journey across the sky, indifferent to the human drama about to unfold within the palace walls. The silence in the king's study stretched like a taut wire as Vikram laid the final photograph on the mahogany desk. King Maharaj Pratap Singh stared at the evidence before him, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he picked up each document. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated every wrinkle on his face, each line telling a story of the burden he now carried. Vikram watched his sovereign's reaction carefully, searching for any sign of prior knowledge or complicity. What he saw instead was the genuine shock and pain of a man discovering that his own blood had betrayed everything he stood for. The king's eyes, which had witnessed the independence of the nation and guided the monarchy through decades of political change, now reflected a deep sadness that seemed to age him years and minutes. "How long have you known about this?" the king asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The authority that usually commanded instant respect had given way to the vulnerable tone of an elderly man confronting an unbearable truth. Vikram could see that his monarch was not asking as a king demanding answers from a subordinate, but as a father seeking understanding of his family's betrayal. 3 weeks, Your Majesty, Vikram replied, maintaining his military bearing despite the emotional weight of the moment. I have spent every available hour verifying these findings and building this evidence. I wanted to be absolutely certain before bringing this matter to your attention. He paused, then added softly, I had hoped to find an innocent explanation for what I discovered. The king stood slowly and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens where Prince Arjun often took his morning walks. The irony was not lost on either man that somewhere in those beautiful grounds, the very person responsible for this betrayal might be enjoying the peaceful morning, unaware that his crimes had been exposed. The monarch's shoulders sagged as he absorbed the full implications of his brother's actions. These items, the king said, pointing to the inventory lists, some of them have been in our family for over 300 years. The peacock crown belonged to my great-great-grandmother. It was worn at her coronation and has been displayed in our private museum ever since. His voice broke slightly as he continued. Tourists come from around the world to see these treasures. They represent not just our family's heritage, but India's cultural legacy. Vikram nodded gravely. His investigation had revealed that the stolen artifacts were not merely valuable antiques, but pieces of living history that connected the present monarchy to its glorious past. Each missing item represented a break in the chain of cultural continuity that the royal family was supposed to preserve for future generations. The theft was not just a crime against property, but an assault on the nation's collective memory. The king turned back to face his loyal guard, and Vikram could see the internal struggle playing out across the monarch's features. As a brother, he would naturally want to protect Prince Arjun from the consequences of his actions. As a king, He had a duty to uphold justice and preserve the integrity of the crown. As a guardian of India's heritage, he could not allow such devastating losses to continue or go unpunished. "Tell me about the buyers," the king commanded, his royal authority gradually returning as he focused on the practical aspects of the crisis. Vikram opened another folder containing intelligence he had gathered about the international network that had facilitated the thefts. The scope of the operation had shocked even his experienced investigative mind. The artifacts are being sold through a sophisticated network of dealers operating in London, New York, and Dubai, Vikram reported. They have established provenance documents that appear legitimate, claiming the pieces are from private collections that have been in European hands since the colonial period. The buyers believe they are purchasing legally acquired antiques with proper documentation. The deception was elaborate and well-planned. Prince Arjun had worked with corrupt officials in the archaeological department to create false export permits dating back decades. These documents suggested that the treasures had left India legally during the British period and were now being resold by their rightful owners. The scheme was so carefully constructed that even experienced collectors and museum curators had been fooled. King Pratap Singh examined the photographs of auction catalogs where palace treasures had been offered for sale. A golden statue of Ganesha, which had been blessed by saints centuries ago and was considered sacred by the royal family, was listed as a private collection piece from a British estate. A set of jeweled daggers that had belonged to warrior kings was described as decorative weapons from an English nobleman's collection. The financial records show that Prince Arjun has received over 2 crores of rupees from these sales. Vikram continued, presenting bank statements and wire transfer receipts. The money has been deposited in accounts in Switzerland and Singapore, beyond the reach of Indian authorities. He has also purchased properties in London and invested in international business ventures. The king's expression hardened as he realized the extent of his brother's betrayal. This was not a moment of weakness or a single poor decision, but a calculated campaign of theft that had been planned and executed over years. The systematic nature of the operation suggested that Prince Arjun had never intended to stop until every valuable artifact in the palace had been sold. "What about the others involved?" the king asked, knowing that such an operation could not have been carried out by one person alone. Vikram had identified at least 6 palace employees who had participated in the scheme, from senior administrators who had falsified documentation to guards who had looked the other way during suspicious nighttime activities. The network extended beyond the palace walls to include government officials who had provided necessary permits, transportation companies that had moved the artifacts without proper documentation, and international contacts who had arranged sales and money transfers. Prince Arjun had used his royal status and connections to build a criminal enterprise that spanned continents. As the morning progressed, Vikram and the king worked through every piece of evidence, constructing a timeline of the thefts and identifying each stolen artifact. The loss was staggering not just in financial terms, but in cultural significance. Manuscripts that scholars had studied for decades were now lost to private collectors who might never allow academic access. Sculptures that had inspired artists and pilgrims for generations were decorating the homes of wealthy foreigners who understood nothing of their spiritual importance. The most painful discovery was a letter from Prince Arjun to one of his dealers, expressing his intention to sell the crown jewels themselves if he could find a way to access them without detection. The prince had written callously about maximizing the value of family assets, as if the crown's most sacred symbols were mere investments to be liquidated for personal gain. King Pratap Singh closed his eyes and pressed his palms against his temples, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his brother's betrayal. When he opened them again, Vikram saw a transformation. The confused and hurt older brother had been replaced by a monarch who understood his duty. The king's voice, when he spoke again, carried the full weight of royal authority and determination for justice. "Captain Vikram Singh," he said formally, "you have served this crown with exceptional honor and courage. Your loyalty and dedication have prevented an even greater catastrophe." He paused, looking directly into Vikram's eyes. "Now I need you to help me decide how to proceed. We must recover what we can and ensure this never happens again. But we must also consider the implications for the monarchy and the nation. The sun had reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the study as two men who had devoted their lives to serving the crown contemplated the most difficult decision either had ever faced. The confrontation that Vikram had dreaded finally arrived on a humid Tuesday evening when Prince Arjun returned from what he had claimed was a diplomatic mission to Europe. In reality, as Vikram had discovered through his investigation, the prince had been in Geneva finalizing the sale of a 14th-century manuscript collection that had belonged to the Royal Library for over 600 years. Vikram had spent the past week preparing for this moment under the king's direct orders. The monarch had decided that his brother deserved a chance to confess and make amends before formal legal action would be taken. It was a decision born of family loyalty, but also of strategic thinking about how to minimize damage to the crown's reputation while ensuring justice was served. The setting for the confrontation was the palace's private dining room, where the royal family had shared countless meals over the decades. King Pratap Singh sat at the head of the table, his expression grave and controlled. Vikram stood at attention near the door, ready to present his evidence when commanded. Prince Arjun entered the room expecting a routine family dinner, his demeanor relaxed and confident until he noticed the formal atmosphere and his brother's stern expression. "Please sit, Arjun," the king said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from him. The prince hesitated, sensing that something was seriously wrong, but his royal training in maintaining dignity under pressure served him well as he took his seat with apparent composure. Vikram noticed, however, that the prince's hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table. The king began slowly, his voice measured and controlled. "Brother, I have learned some disturbing information about activities involving our family's treasures. Before I make any decisions about how to proceed, I want to give you an opportunity to explain your actions and perhaps help us understand what has been happening." Prince Arjun's face remained impassive, but Vikram could see the calculation in his eyes as he processed his brother's words. The prince was intelligent enough to realize that this was not a random inquiry, but the result of a serious investigation. His response would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of the entire royal family. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Prince Arjun replied carefully. "I have always been deeply committed to preserving our heritage. If there have been any irregularities in the handling of palace artifacts, perhaps we should investigate the staff responsible for their care." The attempt to deflect responsibility was transparent, and Vikram could see the king's jaw tighten at his brother's dishonesty. King Pratap Singh nodded to Vikram, who stepped forward and placed a folder on the table in front of Prince Arjun. The contents were arranged in chronological order, starting with bank records showing large deposits coinciding with the disappearance of specific artifacts. The prince's confident facade began to crack as he recognized his own handwriting on inventory lists and saw photographs of empty display cases. "These are your accounts in Switzerland," the king said, pointing to specific bank statements. The deposits match exactly with the dates when palace treasures were reported as being relocated for cleaning or sent for restoration. His voice remained calm, but there was an undertone of deep disappointment that was more devastating than any angry outburst would have been. Prince Arjun's composure finally broke as he realized the extent of Vikram's investigation. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked far older than his 53 years. The weight of maintaining his deception for so long, combined with the shock of discovery, seemed to crush his spirit in an instant. When he looked up at his brother, there were tears in his eyes. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under," he began, his voice breaking. "The allowance the crown provides is barely enough to maintain the lifestyle expected of a prince. My children need the best education, my wife expects to live according to her status, and there are constant social obligations that require enormous expenditure." Vikram had heard such justifications before from corrupt officials he had investigated during his military service, but coming from a member of the royal family, the words seemed particularly hollow. The prince's annual allowance was more than most Indian families would see in a lifetime, and his complaints about financial pressure rang false in the opulent surroundings of the palace. The king listened patiently as his brother continued his explanation, describing mounting debts from poor investments and pressure from creditors who had little sympathy for royal status when payments were overdue. Prince Arjun spoke of gradually increasing his appropriation of palace treasures, starting with items he convinced himself were duplicates or pieces of lesser historical importance. It was supposed to be temporary, he insisted, though his own records showed a systematic escalation over 5 years. I always intended to buy everything back once my financial situation improved. These artifacts mean as much to me as they do to you. The claim was immediately contradicted by his letters to dealers, which showed callous disregard for the cultural significance of the pieces he was selling. As Prince Arjun's confession continued, the full scope of his betrayal became clear. He had not only stolen from the palace, but had also used his royal connections to facilitate the thefts of artifacts from other historical sites across the country. A network of corrupt officials had been funneling precious archaeological finds to international markets, with Prince Arjun serving as their highest-ranking contact and most valuable legitimizing influence. The revelation that the scheme extended beyond the palace walls added a new dimension to the crisis. What had begun as a family matter had become a national scandal that could damage India's cultural heritage for generations. Vikram realized that his initial discovery was just the tip of an iceberg that threatened to undermine the entire system of heritage preservation in the country. King Pratap Singh's response was swift and decisive. Arjun, you will provide us with complete details of every transaction, every contact, and every artifact that has been sold. You will cooperate fully with efforts to recover what can be returned, and you will face the legal consequences of your actions. The king's voice carried the full authority of the crown, making it clear that family loyalty would not override justice. Prince Arjun's attempts to negotiate or minimize his culpability were firmly rejected. The king had already consulted with legal experts and law enforcement officials about the best way to proceed. The decision had been made to treat the matter as a serious criminal case rather than a private family dispute, recognizing that anything less would be a betrayal of the public trust. The confrontation lasted for over 3 hours, with Vikram presenting additional evidence as needed and taking detailed notes of Prince Arjun's admissions. If we protect corruption within our own family, we forfeit any claim to the respect and trust of our people. Vikram remained in the dining room after the prince's departure, helping the king process the evening's revelations and plan the next steps. The loyal guard had fulfilled his duty by exposing the truth, but he understood that the real challenge was just beginning. Recovering the stolen treasures and rebuilding the monarchy's credibility would require the same dedication and courage that had guided his investigation. The palace felt different that night, as if a poison had been drawn from its walls but left behind a wound that would take time to heal. In the distance, thunder rolled across the city, promising rain that might wash away the dust of corruption but could never erase the damage that had been done to India's priceless cultural heritage. 6 months after Prince Arjun's arrest sent shockwaves through both the royal family and the nation, Vikram Singh found himself standing in a London auction house, watching as a centuries-old ivory carving that had once graced the palace's prayer room was returned to Indian custody. The recovery operation had been more successful than anyone had dared hope, but the cost to the monarchy had been devastating. The international investigation that followed Prince Arjun's confession had exposed a network of cultural trafficking that spanned 5 countries and involved dozens of corrupt officials. Interpol had worked closely with Indian authorities to track down artifacts that had been scattered across private collections and auction houses around the world. The cooperation had been remarkable, but the process of actually recovering the stolen treasures proved to be a complex maze of legal challenges and diplomatic negotiations. Vikram had been promoted to Director of Heritage Security, a new position created by King Pratap Singh to ensure that such a catastrophe could never happen again. His first year in the role had been spent traveling between London, New York, Dubai, and Geneva, working with lawyers and law enforcement officials to build cases for the return of stolen artifacts. Each successful recovery felt like a small victory, but the emotional toll of seeing India's heritage scattered among wealthy foreign collectors had been enormous. The legal proceedings against Prince Arjun had concluded just 2 weeks earlier with his conviction on charges of theft, fraud, and conspiracy. The sentence of 15 years in prison had been lighter than many had expected, partly due to his cooperation in recovery efforts, and partly because of the king's request for mercy. However, the prince had been stripped of all royal titles and privileges, effectively erasing him from the line of succession and the official history of the monarchy. The impact on the royal family had been profound. Queen Mother Rajmati, Prince Arjun's beloved mother, had suffered a stroke shortly after learning of her son's crimes and had not spoken since. The king himself had aged visibly during the crisis, his hair turning completely white and deep lines etching themselves around his eyes. Palace staff whispered that he spent long hours in private prayer, seeking guidance on how to restore honor to the crown. Vikram's investigation had ultimately revealed that over 800 artifacts had been stolen from various royal and archaeological sites across India. The recovery rate had been impressive by international standards, with nearly 60% of the items successfully returned, but the remaining losses included some of the most precious and irreplaceable pieces of India's cultural heritage. The famous peacock crown, worth an estimated 50 crores, had been sold to a private collector in Qatar who refused to acknowledge its provenance or consider its return. The financial investigation had uncovered assets worth over 12 crores in Prince Arjun's foreign accounts, money that was being used to compensate victims and fund enhanced security measures at historical sites across the country. However, the true cost of his crimes could never be calculated in rupees alone. The damage to India's reputation as a guardian of its own heritage would take years to repair, and the loss of trust in the royal family had been reflected in declining tourism and reduced international cooperation on cultural preservation projects. King Pratap Singh had responded to the crisis with remarkable transparency, choosing to make the investigation's findings public despite advice from many counselors to handle the matter privately. His decision to prioritize truth over reputation had been vindicated by the generally positive public response. Many Indians had expressed appreciation for the monarchy's willingness to hold its own members accountable, seeing it as a sign of integrity rather than weakness. The reforms implemented in the wake of the scandal had been comprehensive and revolutionary. Every artifact in royal custody had been photographed, catalogued, and fitted with electronic tracking devices. Public access to the palace museums had been increased, with expert guides explaining the historical significance of each piece to visitors. International partnerships with major museums had been established to ensure proper conservation while keeping the treasures within India's borders. Vikram's new security protocols had been adopted as a model by museums and historical sites across South Asia. The system included random audits, multiple authentication procedures, and strict limitations on who could authorize the movement of artifacts. Most importantly, a new legal framework had been established that made the trafficking of cultural heritage a crime punishable by life imprisonment, sending a clear message to anyone who might consider such activities. The personal cost to Vikram had been significant, but bearable. His loyalty to the crown had been tested when several palace officials had attempted to frame him as a co-conspirator in Prince Arjun's scheme. Only the king's unwavering support and the thoroughness of his documentation had protected him from false accusations. His wife had initially urged him to resign rather than risk his reputation and safety, but she had eventually come to understand that his dedication to truth and justice was an integral part of who he was. The international art community had initially resisted Indian demands for the return of trafficked artifacts, claiming that many items had been purchased in good faith from apparently legitimate sources. However, the overwhelming evidence of systematic theft and forgery had gradually shifted opinion in India's favor. Several major auction houses had voluntarily returned items and implemented stronger verification procedures to prevent future acquisitions of stolen cultural property. One of the most moving moments in the entire ordeal had come when a British collector voluntarily returned a 12th-century bronze statue after learning of its true provenance through media coverage of the investigation. The elderly gentleman had inherited the piece from his grandfather and had genuinely believed it had been legally acquired during the colonial period. His gracious gesture had been widely publicized and had encouraged other collectors to examine their own acquisitions more carefully. As Vikram stood in the London auction house, supervising the transfer of the final recovered artifacts, he reflected on the transformation that the crisis had brought about. The royal family's reputation had been damaged, but ultimately strengthened by their response to the crisis. The monarchy had proven that it could adapt and reform while maintaining its essential dignity and cultural significance. The king had announced his intention to establish a new foundation dedicated to the preservation and protection of India's cultural heritage, funded partly by the recovered assets from Prince Arjun's accounts, and partly by voluntary contributions from wealthy Indians who had been inspired by the monarchy's commitment to transparency and accountability. The foundation would work internationally to combat cultural trafficking and would provide expertise and resources to developing countries facing similar challenges. Vikram's final report to the king had concluded with a recommendation that resonated far beyond the immediate crisis. "Your Majesty," he had written, "the greatest treasure we can preserve is not any individual artifact, but the principle that truth and justice must guide our actions regardless of personal cost. Prince Arjun's crimes damaged our heritage, but our response has strengthened our character." The journey back to India was peaceful, the recovered artifacts safely secured in climate-controlled containers and accompanied by experts who would oversee their restoration and return to public display. As his plane flew over the Arabian Sea, Vikram thought about the young guard recruits he would train in the new security protocols and the stories he would tell them about the importance of vigilance in protecting the nation's treasures. The palace came into view as the plane descended toward Delhi, its ancient walls and towers unchanged despite the turmoil they had witnessed. Vikram knew that his work was far from over, that protecting India's heritage would require constant dedication and evolution to meet new challenges. But he also knew that the institution he served had emerged from its greatest crisis stronger and more committed than ever to its essential mission of preserving the past for future generations. The sun was setting as Vikram's convoy arrived at the palace gates, casting the same golden light that had illuminated those walls for centuries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve, but tonight he could rest with the satisfaction of knowing that he had upheld his oath and that India's treasures were safe under his protection once again.